Hello, everyone. My name is Karthik. As I was introduced, I'm doing my PhD on sexuality and law at Nalsar University. I'd like to introduce Professor Madhavi Menon from Ashoka University. Her work is quite inspirational for me, especially because for someone who's looked for books like this and stories like this, to be honest with you, from the age of 9, it's really interesting for me to have read her book and gone through the experiences with her as I read the book, because it very much feels like we're walking through those places she's taking us to in the book and kind of sort of are near those conversations as you read it. One of the most impressive things this book does is it kind of sort of throws open a bunch of ideas that we have about sexuality, and that's really important. What we have today is the narrowing down of concepts, especially around religion and sexuality, right? What it does is it throws open the notions of religion and throws open the notions of sexuality that we have. Even with queerness, there's kind of sort of this consolidation that's happening around identities, and new identities are being constructed through the law, which is a very terrible thing to do, because what queer people really do thrive in is environments where these concepts aren't rigid and, where there's an environment to be free and to express themselves. So on that very thing, I'd like for the first question to be about what is the connection between sexuality and power, and why is sexual repression so closely connected to power all the time?
Thank you, Karthik, for that generous introduction. Thank you to all of you for being here. It's wonderful to be here in Hyderabad and be in this room and to see all of you. It's a huge question you've started out with, Karthik, about the relationship between sexuality and power. And I won't do it justice, but I just sort of want to say a couple of small things, which are actually big things, which is that we tend to think of, weirdly, bizarrely, we tend to think of sexuality as having an inverse relation to power, which is to say, where there is less power, there should be more desire. And that, if anything, is the opposite of what actually happens in our lives, because power actually can be very sexy, and power differentials are inextricable from desire. So to say, oh, you can only have relationships between equals, you can only have relationships of equality, sounds well and good, and I appreciate the sentiment behind it, but it actually does not describe the reality of any kind of desiring relationship. And there is a very sort of very, very strong politically queer angle to this, which is that, of course, we all know in normative heterosexuality, there is no such thing as equality, right? The man is going to be older, richer, more in control of things, and the woman is going to be younger, better looking, certainly not working if she can help it. So that kind of power differential, of course, supports a certain kind of status quo, which I think we all do or should find deeply problematic. But that status quo does not necessarily and only have to do with the difference in power, because a lot of queer politics, as you know, actually thinks about power differentials in age and in status as things that conduce to desire rather than opposing it. So what's interesting about power is that it becomes this thing that we are taught quite rightly much of the time to be suspicious of, but it's actually not something we can live outside of or without. And the sooner we actually start thinking seriously about power rather than just dismissing it or embracing it, but start to think about its complexity, I think we'll be much better off in general.
Absolutely. And I like the fact that you bring out desire as one of bring out a whole conceptual framework around desire itself. Yeah. Because I've always felt like, while we had laws like 377 on the books, they were not really used all that much. But the laws that prohibit desire or kind of sort of censor desire were always active and on the forefront of things. Right. So I'd like to talk about that for a bit, and how desire was really something that the law fully pushed away, pushed away actively at every forefront of its appearance.
Yeah. I mean, let me just sort of begin by talking about 377 for a couple of minutes, if possible. And the 377 judgment, as you all know, the final 377 judgment, much awaited, much celebrated, quite rightly so. It's fantastic that it happened. I'm so grateful and relieved, as are many, many, many of us. And so there's no doubt about that. But what's also interesting for me on 377 from a legal standpoint is that I think it was a bit of a wasted opportunity legally. Because as many of you know, the wording of 377 prohibits what the British called, or what Macaulay called, carnal acts against the order of nature, right? Whether for reasons of squeamishness or prudery or whatever, they couldn't specify anything further than that, right? So it's carnal acts against the order of nature are banned. Now, anybody who is sexually active, in fact, performs carnal acts against the order of nature, if by order of nature, as a lot of courts have interpreted, you mean sex that results in reproduction. Right? So everybody who's sexually active performs carnal acts against the order of nature. Now, the way in which the legal team was able finally to win the judgment in 377 was to say that this disenfranchises and affects adversely the homosexual population in India, which is certainly true. But for me, what was the wasted opportunity is that this was a perfect time to actually say every single one of us, whether we identify as homosexual or heterosexual or whatever it is, every single one of us is potentially adversely affected by 377. And so the ability or the chance to build that kind of broad coalition, to build that kind of solidarity, for me was the wasted legal opportunity of the case in 377. And I understand exactly why the lawyers did it. Many of them are my friends, and they said, unless you sort of speak this new kind of language, you're not, in fact, going to get a judgment from the court. In fact, the earlier Supreme Court judgment, which overturned the Delhi High Court judgment, you actually had a judge of the Supreme Court saying in an open court, to my mind, horrific and astonishing sentence. He said, this doesn't affect anybody. I do not know a single person who is gay, he says, in court. Which is astonishing to me, A, that a Supreme Court justice could say that, but B, we have to think about what it is that allows him to make a statement like that. And what allows him to make a statement like that is that we are getting more and more narrowly defined. And if we actually sort of open up our borders and actually start building coalitions and solidarities, that kind of statement should be impossible for anyone to make, let alone a sitting justice of the Supreme Court.
Yeah, absolutely. And it so feels like what the legacy the British left us with. I think the state and its infrastructure was the most oppressive thing they left us with, really.
Yeah, I realize I didn't address your question about desire, which was really your question, and I went off on 377. You see, the question of desire and the reason why my title talks about desire rather than sexuality is because desire is very slippery, complicated, which is why the laws, of course, have a difficult time with it, right? And so people say, well, why are you talking about love? I mean, the title of a really interesting earlier book is called Same-Sex Love in India. Are you talking about love? Are you talking about sexuality? Are you talking about marriage? I mean, what are you talking about? And my answer always is, I have no idea, which is why I'm drawn to the idea of desire, because you can't actually pin it down or pigeonhole it into this rather than that. You see, people find the concept of love easy to deal with because it sort of comes fully built with a sort of sentimental framework, the idea of what love means, what you do in love. There are thousands of Hallmark greeting cards that talk about love. There are all these nonsense ideas we associate with it. And with sexuality as well, we have a sort of fairly, unfortunately, clear sense of what it means to have an identity based on one's sexual desire. Desire, on the other hand, is what, right? People say, is it sexual desire? Is it non-sexual desire? What are you talking about? And one of the things you'll see if you look at this book is I have 20 different chapters. Don't worry, they're very, very short chapters. But they talk about everyday things, which is to say, usually when we think about desire, we think about something quite rarefied, up on a pedestal that is only accessible to scholars of philosophy or religion or history or whatever it is. But one of the things I wanted to make clear in my book is that our everyday realities are saturated with desire. That every decision we make on a daily basis somehow has to do with the way in which our thinking around desire, around gender, around sexuality has been molded. So how long our hair should be, for instance, how we comb it, how we dress, what we look for in languages, what we look for in education, and I have chapters on all these subjects. Desire is a matter of the everyday. And because it is a matter of the everyday, you can't actually say it is this rather than that, because it permeates and suffuses every aspect of our daily lives. And so the question of desire, and just to sort of give you, one small example to talk about hair, and you can see this in paintings, you can see this in lived life as well, the idea of if you have long hair and you leave your hair loose, that almost automatically conveys to the viewer that you are a loose woman. Whereas, for instance, after women get married, they're meant to tie up their hair to show that their sexuality now is under control. Right? And so this very idea of who has short hair, who has long hair, if you have short hair, why? If you have long hair, what on earth do you do with it? I mean, all these questions we don't even think about, but they very much have a relation to desire. So I'm interested really in the quotidian nature of desire, which of course is exactly what flummoxes the law. Because the law tries to sort of make these grand universal statements that are applicable to all people at all times, which desire, unfortunately, is the wrong subject for, because it's really all over the place with every one of us.
And I was so happy with the place where you began. You began with dargahs, essentially. Yeah. In a world where Islam is increasingly placed, in a position where it's homophobic, and there's this Western intent to kind of sort of push that agenda. I really appreciate the fact that you began with dargahs to kind of sort of counter that narrative. So how did that exploration really begin?
Yeah. I mean, it is quite shocking, the way in which, the world is a shocking place, yes? I think we can all agree to that. And unfortunately for us here in India, it seems to be getting more and more shocking with each passing day. But one of the ways in which it is shocking, and you're right that this does not begin in India at all, although it's being internalized now and imposed on India, one of the ways in which the world is shocking is that people are being encouraged and rewarded more and more to fit themselves into specific and mutually exclusive categories. So you're being encouraged more and more to say, for instance, I am a woman, or I am a man, or I am heterosexual, or I am homosexual, or I am Hindu, or I am Muslim. And one of the most striking and incredibly stunning things about Indic civilizations, by which I mean much more than what we call the political outlines of India today, I mean the sort of entire subcontinental region. What is most stunning about Indic civilizations is that these categories were precisely the ones that were not monitored with any care. And so when we say so-and-so is a Hindu today, for instance, it always shocks me because the very concept of Hinduism as a unified, unitary category was an invention of the British. Before that, we had, remember, we have 330 million gods. In what now counts as Hinduism, is it really possible for followers of 330 million gods to say we are a single unified entity? So even when people say we are Hindus, or the Hindus feel this way, to me it sort of strikes a jarring note, because actually for thousands of years that was not the case in this part of the world. And when people say, oh, Islam is homophobic or Muslims are homophobic, that also just sort of beggars belief. Because the most intense, the most luscious, the most beautiful, stunning, lyrical, same-sex poetry anywhere in the world originates here among the Sufi poets. In Persian poetry that is to this day unrivaled anywhere in the world. And so when, and this was the beginning of your question, Karthik, when you have people sort of from broadly, loosely speaking, the West, even though that's a problematic category, when they say, oh, we are so liberated and you people in the third world are so backward, I mean, you know, depending on my mood, I can either laugh or sort of get really angry. Because, of course, the idea of same-sex desire, the idea of desire that is not contained or containable by physical bodies alone, is an idea we've been familiar with for thousands of years. And so suddenly, the language of identitarian particularity is being narrated as the language of freedom. Whereas the languages that we have had of mobility, of solidarity, of cross-border talks, of cross-border interaction, suddenly that is being not just swept under the carpet, but actively lynched. Actively being disallowed legally, socially, politically. And that is a real loss to my mind, because we've had such richness of desire in this part of the world that to lose that, I think, would be an absolute travesty for us.
And I've somehow always felt like the Western identity formation doesn't sit well with my own lived experiences here. And this is a sense I've had, I mean, like even as I began my exploration into Western television and pop culture, where certain identities were presented, but they never sat right. They never sat right with the experiences that I was going through, and especially those narratives of monogamy and marriage and what those aspirations ought to be for queer people. You know, it just never really worked out. What is this dilemma here? I mean, I'd like to talk more about the dilemma between the identitarian politics and this whole narrative of coming out, of the closet being popularized as a universal principle now.
Exactly. You know, the identity actually only works for one entity, and that's always the state. Right? Identity works very well for the state because then they know how to control us, how exactly to exert pressure on which point. And in fact, what we're seeing in India today is a masterful exercise of what you can do with identity to rip apart a country. Right? So identity works for the state, which is already in and of itself something that should give us pause, because it actually doesn't work for us. All of us sitting in this room, if we think about ourselves and think about ourselves on an everyday basis, do we always feel, for instance, like women and like men? Do we always feel, for instance, our age? Do we always feel identification, deep identification with whatever religious beliefs we subscribe to? I think I'll take the liberty of speaking for all of us to say that's absolutely not the case. That we're all much more multiple and much more problematic than that kind of single identity label would pretend that we are. So if, in fact, the reality on the ground is that we do not fit those single labels ascribed to us, it's shocking to me that we should actually want those single labels. So it's something I genuinely don't understand, which could well be a failing on my part, but it's something that I feel very strongly about, which is, you know, so whenever I have to sort of fill out those forms, and we all have to fill out hundreds of these forms all the time, I always sort of try and leave as many of them blank as I can get away with. Right? You can't get away with leaving too many of them blank. Or for instance, whenever they say, what do they say? Son, daughter, wife of, right? Or what a father's name, of course, is ubiquitous everywhere. So I either sort of get them to change the form, and it's almost always women who are handing out these forms. And I say to them, don't you have a mother? And they said, yes, ma'am, but you know, our mothers don't do anything. And that's just such a, I mean, it's really an awful way to, you know, how we think about labor, and that's a different kettle of fish altogether. But all I want to say is at the very beginning is that identity as a singularizing and singular label does not work for us. It works for agendas that seek to control us, and we need to be wary of those agendas. The trouble for us is that those agendas now come increasingly associated with rewards of various kinds. So if you say you belong to this category, then you can apply for certain things, you will get certain rewards. The downside of that is you will also get read in a particular way, right? So for instance, if you say you are a woman, and therefore then whoever's interviewing you says, oh, let's call her for an interview, she's a woman. And then if you go there and speak with a loud voice, they say, oh my God, she's a woman, why is she speaking so loudly? Right? So it's always, there's always a loss whenever we subscribe to what we think of as a gain. And for me, certainly, that loss is too big for me to want that gain, right? I want to speak with a loud voice. I don't want to necessarily be seen as a woman. Sometimes you have to be, sometimes you don't have to be. But I think if we are all able to reclaim that degree of flexibility in our own lives when we can, that will be a huge achievement. So this question of identity, and again, this is what is so interesting about, again, when I use the West, I'm really using it as this baggy term that does not do justice to the complexities of the West, but just as a shorthand. So when we think about identity in the West, and I've always sort of said this, that the West thinks of itself as, free from homophobia now and, sort of homophilic in that sense. And for me, the West is superficially homophilic, but deeply homophobic, deeply, profoundly homophobic. Whereas this part of the world might be, and not always, but might be superficially homophobic, but is deeply homophilic, right? There is residual memories in our cultural history that predispose us to thinking seriously, kindly, openly about, for instance, we see this every day, men holding hands in public, right? If you do this in small town America, you are going to get lynched. Women sleeping together in the same bed, for instance. Does anyone even think about this twice? No. So these are things we need to keep in mind when people say, oh, you are so backward and we are so forward. And we really have to think about alternative traditions that have actually existed here, cutting across religions, cultures, languages, genders, sexualities, that we've actually been heir to for thousands of years. So the language of sexual identity is not a language that I like particularly. And so, for instance, I've often got into trouble for saying I'm not a big fan of the entire concept of pride marches in India. In the West, it makes a lot of sense because their only relation to sexuality has been that of shame. And when you have your religious traditions and cultural traditions telling you that you always have to be ashamed of your sexuality, it makes perfect sense to have marches called pride marches when you're trying to assert that, in fact, sexuality is not something to be ashamed of. The reason I don't think it works in India, or the reason I'm critical of its imposition in India, is because I feel we have so many rich traditions which have nothing to do with shame in relation to sexuality. And so if we pick up on, and for reasons that I am sympathetic to, but if we pick up on the last 250 years of an unsuccessful imposition of a certain kind of Victorian morality or shame, if we pick up on that as our only inheritance, and therefore claim the idea of pride, then again we are losing out on a lot. That we're giving up on a lot that we can actually provide to the rest of the world as an alternative way of thinking about desire. Right? So not only pride, which certainly works in certain religious contexts, not in the context of the subcontinent, where the religious traditions have themselves been so conducive to thinking about this kind of plurality of desire.
I'd like to know more about, I've always been curious about this. Where did this animosity in Christianity begin, really? It's a question that I've always had and never gotten an easy answer for it. Everyone has their own theory about it. Yeah. Many scholars I met have their theory about it. Some say that it kind of sort of began as a struggle against Bacanism in the pagan traditions of before, where Christianity brewed. But we don't have a clear-cut answer for where this culture of shame really begins. My next question is connected to a wonderful chapter of yours labeled Sambandham. I found it most fascinating. I think if you could read if you read the beginning part of that and then get into it, as I said, this book feels like I'm, there with you, and that's one of the parts where I felt like I was really there with you.
I probably won't read because I think that beginning part that you're talking about won't give a sense of the chapter, but let me talk
Right.
about it
Sure.
a little bit. So the chapter that Karthik is talking about is the chapter on Sambandham. I don't know how many of you are here from Kerala, but if you are, you'll know that Sambandham is a name not for marriage, but for the kinds of sexual relationships that Kerala Nayar women have had for centuries, where the women don't get married to men. The reason they don't get married to men is that Kerala Nayar women, it's a matrilineal system, so you inherit your property through the woman, and you pass down your name through the woman. And as we all know, and if you don't know, let me be the first to tell you, marriage is very much about property and about the name. And of course, which is why women are encouraged to change their names after marriage, because you suddenly become your husband's property, right? And the Kerala Nayar women, of course, being smarter than all of us centuries ago, said, we already have the property in the name, why the hell should we get married to mere men, right? So they sort of dismissed the idea of marriage, would have sex with whoever they wanted. The joke was that, if men would come to their houses, and the woman would signal that she was otherwise occupied by asking the man to leave his umbrella and slippers outside the door. So that other sort of prospective lovers or suitors would say, oh, she's busy tonight, okay, maybe I'll come back tomorrow night or another day, right? The men had no control or say over the children because they belonged to the household of the mother, and the property passed on through the women among them. So you have here, again, what I keep using the word for, an alternative structure in which sons are not fetishized, in which sons don't inherit property, and in which sons don't pass on the name. And so then you have this tradition of incredibly strong Nayar women in Kerala. And this again sort of entirely changes when the British come and say, what do you mean you're not going to get married? Right? What do you mean you're not going to change your name? And all of us, because we're right now in the south of India, we know this. The idea of having a last name that is a surname is actually not that usual, right? Many of us just have an initial and a name, because that idea of a surname, which, by the way, comes from your sir's name, your father's name, is a British idea. And they say, you as a child belong to your father's property. You have to have that name attached to you, right? It's like any brand product. It's like Airtel. If you belong to Airtel, then you have Airtel attached to your name. Maybe we should all do that. Maybe we should all adopt mobile phone names as our names. But in any case, that's meant to be your father who owns you. And so that notion of having a first name and a last name, which is your father's, is only about 200 years old in this country. It's only about 250 years old in this country. And the practice of Sambandham stands very much in stark contrast to that. Because you didn't have your father's name either as an initial or as your last name. Your initial was your mother's Taravad name, which is your mother's household name. And your property came through your mother. So this idea, this obsession, or what seems to be an obsession in India today about getting people married, is not that old an obsession. In fact, even the sort of, this idea of marriage and reproduction and all, they have histories. And they have very clear, very deeply economic histories. They have nothing actually to do with desires, certainly not with love, much as we might fool ourselves into thinking that. And I think, when we as parents obsess about our children getting married, when we as children obsess about everybody getting married, it's good to take a breath and say, what the hell is this obsession? Where did it come from? And I think we should all resolve not only to change our names to our mobile phone names, since we live on it all the time, but also not to get married. I mean, I don't understand what this big deal is about marriage. So those of you who are here and not married, don't do it. And those of you who are here and are married, just sort of tell your partner, it's been lovely knowing you. And, maybe we can go on knowing each other for a long time, but we just don't have to have one another's names. We don't have to do Mr. and Mrs. We don't have to have joint bank account. All that paraphernalia that comes with it. Let's do something more fun with that.
I'm fairly certain my own family could have benefited quite a lot by taking that advice. On that note, I think we should ask the audience if they have any questions.
So I wanted, you brought up about pop culture.
Right.
I wanted to ask about pop culture in India, since a movie like Shubh Mangal Zyada Savdhan is going to come up next month. And where do you think like concepts of gender and sexuality in a society, and like with a movie, how sensitive are they? Like when do they not cross the line and be and portray the so-called stereotypes which the previous movies have done, and it has become a joke. And a majority of us today, at least even one of us, probably will go out today, maybe watch a joke on it and probably laugh, which is marginally homophobic as well. So where do you like draw the line?
You know, usually I have a rule that the first question I never allow a man to ask. But since we are very much in the fluid zone, I'm going to just assume that you're not a man, and sort of take it as that. Because we all know this. Women sort of censor themselves all the time. Men feel very free to speak up, even when they don't have anything to say, which is not the case with you. Your question was wonderful. And so this is something also we need to be aware of. Those of us who teach or who appear in public, don't give men too much time, because they already are given a lot of it. So your question is about popular culture and how popular culture can talk about sexuality without necessarily straying into the zone of stereotyping it or converting it into a joke, which I think is a fairly difficult question to think about or respond to. Because, of course, one person's stereotype is another person's reality. One person's seriousness is another person's joke. And I don't think there's any way one can mandate for a universal reception to any cultural artifact. It's absolutely impossible, which is as it should be. This Shubh Mangal Savdhan, like you, I've only watched the trailer. And it certainly seems interesting. But, how do I put it? It's interesting because a certain kind of Anglophile urban crowd will say, oh, finally Indian cinema is becoming westernized, so this is good and let us accept it. What I find more interesting, even though I am part of the Anglophile urban crowd, what I find more interesting is the other crowds, of which also I think of myself as a part, which actually loves Bollywood, for instance, and I'm a big fan of Bollywood primarily, and I don't know as much about regional cinema, and I'd love to hear from you, in which same-sex desire has been there on screen for decades. Right? If you just think about all your Dostana movies, with Amitabh Bachchan and Shashi Kapoor looking deep into one another's eyes. I mean, excuse me, right? Or Dharmendra and Amitabh Bachchan, any of them, right? Any of those couples that you can think of. So there is a way in which we already have other ways in which to think about the queerness of desire that are not recognized as such because it does not conform to a certain kind of identity politics. So again, with a loss, there's a gain. With a gain, there's a loss. I think that if non-Anglophone urban India loves this film, it's because hopefully it will remind us of what we already know, what we've seen in Bollywood, and what we've been heir to over centuries.
Any other questions?
And remember, a woman, please, this time.
Yes, there you go. We have.
Thank you.
Maybe you can take both questions.
Absolutely.
Yeah? All right.
So I wanted to ask, how does the concept of asexuality, not a concept, but just another form of sexuality, how does it set well with desire as a concept?
Yeah. You know, one of the... Oh, you want me to take it?
Let's take her question as well. And
Sure.
you can.
Hello. I'm sorry I came very late, but I
didn't
just
miss
got,
much.
I got the last part of this thing when you were talking about women. My experience has been that in the gay movement, the support of women is, it's a given. You have to, as a woman, you must support gay culture. But the problem is when, as a woman, because we're all genderized, if I have a problem with, say, a gay pride march or something, a slogan, there's a huge attack on you, It's an attack on you as a woman, because as a woman you're supposed to be more empathetic to their pain. So the attack is on you, But as an intellectual, nobody wants to, even talk about you as an intellectual. They all attack you because as a woman, you should be empathetic to their pain. Oh, they've gone through so much of pain, so you should be empathetic towards that. But if a male says anything, then it could be an intellectual attack. But if a woman is like, says anything, even if she squeaks up, there is like, oh, as a woman, you're not empathetic. Oh, dan, dan, dan. So what is happening is...
I like the sound effects.
Yeah, really. I mean,
so
I think
I got your question. Let me just sort of address the asexuality one first. One of the chapters in this book is on celibacy, which is not necessarily the same as asexuality, but it's in the vicinity, so I'll just use that as an example. And people were very surprised that I was writing a book on desire and wanted to write a chapter on celibacy. But celibacy is just because you do not necessarily have sex the way in which people understand sex normally to be had, doesn't mean you don't have a relation to desire. And celibacy marks both historically and culturally a fascinating component in sort of Indic cultures in its relation to desire. So for instance, not only do we have long cultures, for instance, of Tantra, where you will not have sex genitally, but everything that you do has to do with desire. Whether it is that you're breaking taboos and sort of drinking menstrual blood or whatever it is, there is a relationship to desire, which I think is the same of asexuality as well. So I think the danger we're falling into is to thinking about sexuality always as identity categories, rather than as a relation to desire, which asexuality has. Just to go to the second, I don't know whether it was a question, but a statement. Certainly, I think women are assumed to have sort of more in common with minority movements around the world, precisely because we are a jeopardized and ill-treated minority ourselves, and have been for centuries. The trouble with expecting women to all behave in a certain way or respond in a certain way is that A, clearly it's not true. The reason, for instance, patriarchy flourishes is because many, 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 many women support it. And many, many, many women transmit it, right? We are often told by women that women should behave this way and men should behave that way. And that is patriarchy's greatest success, is to sort of have cleft the demographic of women into so many parts that we cannot, in fact, speak with a unified voice. Having said that, I completely agree that I don't think a unified voice is necessarily desirable. And but it's an old disjunction you talk about, right? Women being associated with emotion and men being associated with intellect. That cuts across all categories. Having said that, I think one of the strengths of queer politics today is, and should be, our ability to take on board all kinds of criticisms that are not phobic, right? I don't think anyone should take any phobias on board, but criticisms that are genuine, and to think about it, because queer politics only exists because we see that things need to be done differently. And if we want to do things the same old way, then it's not queer any longer.